Hi, Tanay. Welcome to Venture with Grace.
Hi, Grace. Thank you for having me. I've been listening to this in its podcast form for a while, and so excited to be on.
Oh, I'm so excited. So let's start with I want to give the audience a little bit of your background. So like you started your career as a software engineer and you have worked at so many iconic companies like Google, Zinga, Palantir, and McKinsey, Facebook, like just to name a few. So why don't we start with like what are some core lessons that you've learned early on in your career working at these big organizations that kind of shape you into how you think about startups?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And so one of my first internships in this is about maybe 15 years ago, almost 13 years ago at this point, was at Zinga, and it was the summer that they had just gone public. And even though I didn't realize at the time, I ended up learning one of the most interesting things that stuck with me since then, which is the importance of platforms and the platform risk that comes when you build a business on top of another platform. And
Mhm,
so Zynga was pretty much built on top of Facebook.
mhm,
And at one point, about 10 to 15% of Facebook's revenue came from Zynga, and pretty much like
mhm,
80+% of Zynga's revenue came from Facebook. And what happened was that as Zynga had just gone public, they had this blockbuster IPO right a few months before I kind of interned there. And during the internship, the stock dropped like 75% because what had happened was that Facebook filed to go public, and as part of it, they kind of one revealed how much Zynga was kind of dependent on them. But then
mhm,
also Facebook people on Facebook, I don't know if you remember, Grace, but people would play Farmville and things and get like
mhm, mhm,
bombarded with notifications from friends of like, oh,
mhm,
this friend is inviting you to because they want jewels or lives or whatever it
mhm,
was. And Facebook decided that that was bad for long-term user engagement, and so it started to deprioritize those comments, those notifications from people about Zynga games on the platform, which was a risky move for Facebook because they also depended on Zynga for revenue. But because they did that over time, the Zynga DAUs and usage dropped because they were so reliant on Facebook for that kind of continuous engagement loop.
mhm,
And over time, that's why the stock dropped like 70, 80%, that kind of over that 3 to 6 month period. And in some ways, it never really recovered post then.
mhm,
And so even though I didn't realize at the time, it ended up being this pretty interesting lesson in the importance of platform risk uh,
mhm,
quite early on, and that's what got me interested as well in kind of like the more of the I would say like the business or the financial side of some of these things, where Facebook's S1 was probably one of the first ones that I read because it had been published around that period when I was interning Zynga, and like the
mhm,
Zynga stock was falling so much, and I was an intern, but a lot of my colleagues obviously had a lot of their equity and net worth in the stock, and so we're monitoring the stock price on a daily basis. And so yeah, so that was probably um, one of my kind of both my first kind of experience in the valley, and then one of the most kind of poignant lessons that I've still taken to then. I think the other one was just the seeing the energy at the time in San Francisco. This is about this 2012, 2013, and I
mhm,
remember Lyft was just getting started, and so you'd see those pink mustaches everywhere on the cars, and just seeing some of these companies over time then become these large and iconic companies. I think it kind of gave me a sense of like the people around me are the ones that are creating these things, and that anyone can, with the right amount of dedication, hard work, and like insight into like an idea, can kind of create
mhm,
something. And so that was also a very interesting one. And then I'll kind of skip to maybe McKinsey, which was my first full-time job. I think there was very much just about uh, I think what McKinsey teaches you really well is how to structure problems really well, and then how to just, no matter what you're thrown into and no matter what kind of new area you're facing, how do you actually just break down the problem into something that's solvable and figure out how to get up to speed very quickly on it, and then
mhm,
get it to a point where you know how to solve the problem no matter how kind of complicated it is. And so the idea of this kind of like structured thinking, how do you break down problems, and then how do you get up to speed really quickly, which as a VC today is quite important because you end up spending a lot of your time getting up to speed in new things because you will intercept an interesting founder working in something that you don't know that much about, but could be
mhm,
potentially very interesting. And so you then have to do the work very quickly to see if you can get to conviction on it. And so that's been like a helpful lesson as well. And then Meta, where I spent about 4 and a bit years on product across kind of the newsfeed ranking side, as well as more just on Instagram on kind of a lot of the video and creator products. I would say the main lesson from there was just how to build very good data-driven products. And Facebook always had a very product-driven culture, and so very much about how do you, given the goal that you're trying to get to with your product, how do you ruthlessly prioritize deciding what to work on to be able to hit that goal, and then how do you always take a very data-driven view to both user research and then also to launching things. And so pretty much every single thing that Meta launched is A/B tested for weeks ahead of launch, where to like the 0.1% on any important metric like time spent, users, engagement, how that change is going to impact that the business across the key metrics. And you only ship things which are moving the important metrics that you as your team care about or the company cares about over time. And so that very much like that kind of very data-driven approach to making sure that products are moving in the right direction based on what the company thinks or what you as the product org thinks is the right direction for that given product that you're working on.
For sure. Maybe we could start with your role at Wing before we dive deeper. So you have made a few investments. So you have invested in like AI powered operations for professional services and the AI coworker for insurance or AI native performance advertising platforms. So why don't we start with like how did you think about like which part of AI that you want to spend time on, since like right now I think everything is AI, and how do you like I guess like research for your own newsletter or for the trends that you are seeing and then actually funnel into like a chain of thoughts of like investment thesis basically.
Sure. Yeah. And so, in terms of where I spend most of my time at Wing, I primarily invest at the application layer. So in kind of AI powered and AI native
Mhm.
applications. And it tends to take a few forms and happy to talk about those. But high level at Wing, we tend to invest about half of what we do is more downstack or infra layer. And so data and AI infra, cybersecurity, things like that. And then the other half of what we do is more application layer, so both in functional areas or horizontal markets. And so whether it's sales, marketing, general productivity, recruiting, the functional areas like that, or in verticals. And so bio and health is a big vertical for us, where we have a few folks that spend most of that time on that vertical. And then we also do things in financial services, legal, commerce, and retail, and kind of all the other verticals as well. I initially probably spent a bit more of my time on the more in the data and AI infra layer, just because some of that was happening sooner at the time, like post the initial wave. And then also in the past, as I mentioned, I was a PM on newsfeed ranking. And so even though we'd built a lot of our own systems in-house at Facebook, I had a kind of good sense of what all the various layers of the stack needed there. But also as a firm, we'd been actively investing in that area for a while. And so a lot of the main areas of investment, whether it's things like vector databases or data processing engines, we already did have investments in some of those. And so I still spend some of my time on it. I'm generally looking for companies that have some unique tech, whether it's like domain specific foundation models or things like that they then are applying in a full stack way. But a portion of me also, but part of me believes that a lot of the valuable companies will be quote unquote like this full stack, or also kind of delivering the product directly to the end user. And so that's why I probably spend more of my time at the application layer, where I think there's just a lot more opportunities, because I think we're starting to see that the models can do a lot, but there's a lot to be done in that last mile to take the models and make them usable and valuable to end users across different roles and functions that they sit in. And so most of my time is spent on those, whether it's some of the co-pilots for some of these industries, or the agentic co-workers for some of these industries, and then over time potentially full-fledged AI native kind of systems for these verticals and functional areas as well. And yeah, so that's kind of where I spend most of my time. In terms of as you mentioned, the research and things, I would say it's probably two things when it comes to just like having a point of view investments. About some of the investments we make are where we have like a very prepared mind. And for me, where you've done a lot of work in the industry, you're specifically almost looking for a company in that industry or vertical because you've done the work, you believe there's an opportunity, you've probably gone and met many of the companies in that space, and maybe you found one that is right, in which case you try to invest, or maybe you've not found one that quite fits with your thesis, but you're still looking for it. And that's kind of a common path for us as well. And they're usually what my approach is in terms of even what are the areas that I want to go deeper in is partly it's one defined by based on what the models can do today and and what they're good at and where they already can excel at. What does that mean for who should be putting this into practice already today? And so I think a lot of, for example, a lot of it started with AI co-pilots that helped predominantly knowledge workers. And so a lot of what I was focusing on earlier on were companies that were building co-pilots either to help you directly in your core work as a knowledge professional, so in like legal, financial services, or in kind of say sales, marketing areas like that, insurance. Or I was looking for things that were less co-pilots, but more agentic type products that would take away a lot of the drudgery that these people had in their day-to-day lives. And so things that they spent a lot of time doing that they didn't necessarily like to do, where hopefully AI can kind of take it off their plate so that they then get more time back to spend on the things that they actually like. And so that was kind of like some of the, core theses or areas where I had prepared minds in, and I would go kind of vertical by vertical as well. And then the other half of kind of what ends up happening is more like you have like a high level of what you're looking for. So like I'm looking for agentic coworkers in functions, right, or something, and you just intercept a really interesting founder who is building in maybe an area that you don't know that much about, but you just think that they're a good founder and they have a very clear articulation of their vision and problem of the problem and the they're trying to solve, and the vision of their company and how they're going to use AI as a wedge to then go build beyond that. And you do the work after you meet them and you get excited and you can kind of get to conviction and you go from there. And so that's kind of the other shape that some of these take, which is you haven't really gone super deep in the industry, but it generally aligns with what you believe is going to happen with kind of AI, and you do the work after you meet the founder and are able to get to conviction.
I wonder, so maybe we could start with like the last point that you mentioned about like agentic coworker. So first of all, like how do you think about agentic coworker? What's the difference between if I just use ChatGPT or like something that's currently everybody's using for like basically the AI solution for part of your workflow, versus like what is an agentic coworker? What does it mean for you?
Sure, yeah. And so I think high level, and I think ChatGPT is getting more into agents as we speak. They launched ChatGPT Agent a few days
Yeah.
ago. But if you think about their traditional product, which is more of like the chatbot, where you ask it something specific, you get back an answer. It typically isn't, and they had deep research and things, but those typically weren't taking actions. Those were doing mostly forms of research for you. And they were like, deep research technically is an agent in some form, but it's not like an agent that's taking action. It's typically preparing like a report. So if your action is you need to prepare a report, then it's doing that action. But if it's like you need to do something in some system, then it's not really doing that, right? And so I think one big difference between these kind of agentic coworkers and more of like a generalized ChatGPT is this idea that it's very built for the specific domain that's being built in. And I can give some examples. But it's very much on the idea of like what are the core actions and tasks that the human does as part of their job, and AI, based on what it's good at, can do some of those actions pretty reliably, as good or maybe even better than a human can. And so it can't do the whole job better than the human, but there's some set of tasks that humans do as part of their work that it can do better than the human. And so what if we had this agent that was doing these tasks on behalf of the human, and the human was still the one that was managing it and doing a lot of the work in terms of just like assigning tasks to it, making sure that it doesn't go off the rails and all of those things. And so I think that's kind of one major difference. And the way that it generally plays out is that if you think about some of the common agentic coworkers today, like in like Devin in engineering, or some of these AI SDRs, or the customer support agents.
Mhm.
None of them can do 100% of the work, but what they can do is you can think of them as interns or junior employees that are AI powered interns or junior
Mhm.
employees that can do some portion of the work with the right amount of guidance, but that you can assign tasks to, and then you can go back to doing whatever you were doing, and then you come back and that task is kind of done, and then you can review it before you end up incorporating it into your workflow. And usually they're built very much with the persona in mind. And so I think the right way to actually build these things is like, if you take a role, so let's say you take something like SDRs, you
Mhm.
map out, okay, what are the 10 tasks that they spend their days and weeks doing? And you decide like, hey, which ones are AI agents good at doing versus which ones are they not good at doing? And so if you think about something like an AI SDR, things like account research that and getting emails and creating lead lists and some of those things, AI can do it a lot faster. It can do much
Mhm.
deeper research than a human can in terms of in a given period of time. And so
Mhm.
those are things that it can do probably better than a human SDR. Now, when it comes to getting on the phone and calling the person, or
Mhm.
responding to the objections when you send an email, like drafting the personalized email, it can also do that because it can do a lot of them very quickly. And then when it comes to responding to the objections or having a long conversation via email, or if it's an SDR that interacts on the phone, technically AI isn't legally allowed to make outbound calls. And so those things it can't do at all. And so what you do is you build an agent that can do the tasks that AI is good at, and it can kind of do them in the background and take that work off of the plate, off
Mhm.
the human. And then you have maybe like a co-pilot that helps with the other tasks, or just something, or you let the human do the tasks that they are good at because you've given them back 40 to 50% of their time. And so I think that's kind of like how a lot of what some of these agentic coworkers look like. The other thing on them, and partially this is a little bit self-serving on behalf of the Valley as well as every founder building in it, is that a lot of them are being kind of called these coworkers and being called like AI SDR because people are trying to tap into the labor budgets
Mhm.
for the roles as opposed to the software spend on these roles. Because in many categories, especially if there is labor shortages, or over time those companies intend to hire people, if you can give something that's 60% as good or 50% as good on a set of tasks as the human equivalent, then over time what that means is they may need to hire or add net new fewer humans in that job role at that company. And so hopefully you can charge as a percent of some fraction of the labor, like say 10% of the labor, 20% of the labor cost, which can open up much larger budgets than if, say, they compare you to some software tool and they're comparing you to, like, oh, what's the per seat we're willing to pay for this product. Because these things are ultimately doing work, and the work that they do doesn't scale based on the number of seats necessarily, but it might scale just based on the amount of work that was assigned to it. Or just like, like if you wanted to research 25,000 people, it can do that. Like, it doesn't really matter. It's just more GPUs and compute. And so people are trying to capture that labor budget because it, one, leads to easier sales cycles in some cases, but then also potentially over time much larger ACVs. And so that's kind of like the other part, which is, there's this big debate right now of like, is AI good for SaaS? And the kind of the approach that leads to it being yes, it is this idea that you can tap into these labor budgets and services budgets. And the idea that it's bad is this whole, oh, everyone's going to vibe code their own apps and they're going to be, no one's going to ever pay for software again type of thing. So
I have so many questions there. One is like I was digesting partially of the things that you mentioned earlier about like your early lessons of like Zinga being on top of Facebook, that like you are like one app is living on top of another platform, so there's maybe a lot of like risk associated with it. But I was thinking like I feel like for the Chinese apps, actually, a lot of the stuff are just on WeChat, right? So, like, it's kind of like there is 400 applications that's literally on one app, and then people are still, like, using it, and even, like, some of the billion-dollar companies are, like, created based off these, like, mini programs slash, like, just apps on top of something. I feel like what does that kinda look like in the AI space nowadays? Because, I wonder if you can build something just like I think a lot of the AI companies right now are kind of like GPT wrappers, but ChatGPT itself is like creating these different things, right? So like for example, in the past, like Motion was trying to do this like AI agent thing. It
Mhm.
helps you like book a flight and stuff. But now like, like OpenAI's like agent, I was literally watching it doing some of the stuff that I wanted to do. And it is like kind of like achieving the equivalent of like some of these AI companies. What are something that you feel like big companies are not gonna just take over? And so those are like two separate questions. One part is like, is there like a big platform everyone will build on top of? And then the second question is like, what are some stuff that are like big company are not going to build?
Yeah. So on the first one, I think maybe one distinction between the Zynga Facebook scenario and
Mhm,
then the current kind of building on top of the models that's happening
mhm,
right now is that in the Facebook scenario, it was very much like Zynga relied on Facebook for its core engagement loops. And so the user acquisition, giving notifications back to remind people to play the games. And so the whole product was dependent on being on top of Facebook in a way that's different than, say, like even a mobile app that is in the app store, but as long as you don't break the app store rules, they won't remove you. So there is risk in that they could
mhm,
remove your app, but like as long as you follow the rules, they won't. But you're not relying on
mhm,
it 100% to get all your users and everything in the same way that Zynga was at the time before they
mhm,
diversified into mobile gaming and things. And similarly with the models today, like yes, the risk is that the model capabilities keep increasing, and so the models themselves directly can do what your app was built to do. But I don't think there's that much of a risk of, oh, if this model cuts you out, you're in a tough situation. Just because I think what we're seeing is that across the board, there typically are the gap between the first and the second best across
mhm,
in most, whether it's image models, in fact, video probably has the biggest gap right now, I'd say, between VO3 and maybe like a Kling 2.1. But in all the other modalities, the difference between the first and the second is not as large, and I think will over time continue to compress. And so you will have options to swap between them. And so the risk isn't that, oh, like if one of them cuts you off, you're in a difficult position. Although I think in coding that is a risk, and I think we saw what happened with Windsurf just because Claude was so much further ahead on code compared to some of the other models. But and so while it is a risk, I don't think it's that much a risk for most companies. Just because I think you will have different models you can use. But I think the other point you mentioned of like the model providers, ultimately, if the model gets good enough, like what you've built around the model is
mhm,
not going to be as important or relevant. I do think that's a real one. I think on that idea of like what won't these big companies build, I think what you're seeing is that in some ways they are starting to pick a little bit of directions. And so OpenAI, I think, is obviously they're continuing to improve their models, but then OpenAI is a little bit, I'd say, more consumer focused. A lot more of their revenue comes from ChatGPT. And so they've continued to innovate on that, continue to add new
mhm,
features there that make ChatGPT more useful to the general knowledge worker. And I do think it's a big question of, as ChatGPT improves for the general knowledge worker, will there still be opportunities where will the opportunities be? And I think it's clear that any of the big horizontal use cases, they will have a competitive offering. Because if it's something like, oh, can you just do like not basic research across like various data sets, or including your kind of calendars and your private data, like they will compete in areas like that. And so enterprise search, I do think is an area, like horizontal areas like that are ones where the models will compete. Where I think it's less clear is whether they'll be competing in very deep functional or domain areas. And so will they be building specifically for like the insurance use case as an example, or like in financial, and they do have versions for like financial services, but it's still very much like a chatbot, which isn't necessarily the right interface for all these different roles. And so to me, I think like companies that will, at least in the short term, be away from the kind of the grasps of these large model companies are the ones that are picking a very specific domain or a functional focus, and then building for that role or function, and building the right set of things other than just the generalized chat workflow, which I think the chat GPTs can do well as well, but really building with the workflows in mind, and with that kind of deep focus on that customer segment in mind.
mhm,
And so I think that's kind of where we'll see it. And what has been interesting is that, for example, coding was one where you can think of it as a functional area, but that's one that they've clearly shown a lot of interest in. But I think that's because coding has a lot of advantages for just model improvement in general, and for just like it's a critical kind of building block for just in general having a great model. And so I think coding is one where we're seeing that they will compete. I think over time we might see them verticalize more and go into, say, big verticals like customer service and things like that. But so far, at least, it's not clear that they are taking those moves. And so I think for now, these companies that are focused on, like support and marketing and sales, or even like insurance and financial services, as long as they go deep enough in that vertical and are adding value beyond just building a chatbot, I think they'll probably be okay in at least the short to medium term.
For sure. Want to give a quick shout out to our friend David. Hi. Okay, so I want to start with like one of your newsletters. So this one is on like agentic commerce. So I personally, I'm really interested in the space, but I kind of feel like um a lot of big tech companies are already doing partially of the thing. So why don't we start with like if you could give us like an overview of this article, and then we can dive deeper into some of the subjects.
Sure, yeah. And so I guess the origin of this was that I found myself in ChatGPT more often asking for product recommendations. And so I was buying a pair of shoes and I told it, hey, this is the current shoe I have. I
Mhm,
even took a photo and gave it to it, and it started to analyze the
mhm,
wear and tear of the shoe. And based on that, like, my gait and what kind of cushioning I needed where, based on that. And so it then returned like, a list of potential shoes. And then I ended up going to the store, trying out the three that are mentioned and picking the one that I like best. But it
mhm,
felt to me that it was clear that over time that these big platforms, whether it's the chat GPTs or the perplexities, will go deeper into this because they are being used as a search replacement. And um, a big part of search, there is a decent portion of queries in search that are commercial queries. And so people looking for things and with an intent to find them. And
mhm,
today they're already very good at the top of the funnel part. So based on what you tell it about what you're looking for, it can kind of suggest a few options to you, and can ask you other questions to help you kind of narrow that down. And
mhm,
what they aren't as good at is maybe like showing you the full information, the enriched information about it. And so OpenAI recently partnered with Shopify to start doing some of this, but it would just give you a list of items and it was just all text. And now they actually show you images, and it can even show you the right pricing, and you can click on it and go to the link. And
mhm,
it was clear to me like where this was headed was that over time they would be able to, or they would allow for companies to or allow for users to be able to more go deeper in that funnel. So can you do the decision of the last three, and how do you decide between them and
mhm,
compare them and just make that decision within ChatGPT? And then finally, would you be able to do the checkout and the purchase in ChatGPT as well? And so that was kind of like what prompted the kind of going deep into this area. And the basic premise is that over time, agents will be a core part of like the actual purchasers of items and they'll be doing it on behalf of users. But it also unlocks a lot of interesting use cases where you can tell an agent, hey, like if this thing ever drops to under $100, buy it for me. So it can be like long running things like that, or it could just be, hey, like, and I think Amazon and things have tried this in the past, right? But it was mostly used for like, oh, reorder me my toilet paper, or like things that were
mhm,
basic like that weren't as interesting. Whereas now I think there's an opportunity where the whole loop or the full funnel of commerce, like discovery, consideration, and then even transactions and checkout, could happen via agents. And so that was kind of like the basic premise. And the idea is like what would be needed to enable this world, and what's kind of not working or broken today that needs to be fixed for that world. And so one example is that historically, when it comes to payments, the idea of bots are treated as bad because usually that bots means it's something trying to be fraudulent. Whereas
mhm,
with agentic commerce, you have the bots making legitimate purchases on behalf of people. And so if you're someone like Stripe or Visa, and they've launched some tokenization efforts and initiatives in this regard, you have to kind of adapt your systems to a world where not all bots are bad, and that a bot could actually be acting with permissions off a user and be basically an actor that you want to allow the payment through, because they are like legitimate and not like fraudulent. And so things like that will need to change. And then for another example is that if you think about storefronts today, like let's take most stores that are built on Shopify, or even if they aren't built on Shopify, the experience is optimized for the human consumer. And so it's like you have a website, you can browse through different items in the catalog and transact. Whereas if the agents are the main consumers, or not the main, but over time an increasingly important consumer of your brand's storefront, you need to change the way that you might want to optimize it for that brand as well. And there's this kind of new category called GEO or AIO, which is AI optimization, which is much broader than just commerce. But that idea is like, oh, you have to make sure you show up in these search engines, or these kind of answer engines like ChatGPT if you're a brand or any kind of business. But I think with commerce, it goes further, because it's not just about, your product showing up, but you need to give it the right information. They need to know all the sizing that's available, all the catalog information, all the pricing in real time. And then it needs to be able to hopefully be able to buy those items as well directly via these interfaces at some point. And so I think there's going to be a lot of work done on the merchant side as well to enable that world where all of these items are browsable and shoppable from a lot of these platforms that are agentic, that will increasingly kind of go down to that direction. And so that's kind of like the basic premise of the piece. And it talks about some of the different kinds of areas where there will be things that need to be solved, some of which I do think will be built by the incumbents themselves. And so whether that's like a Stripe or a Visa, and then some of which, or a Shopify, and then some of which I think there might be interesting opportunities for independent startups as well.
I wonder, since like I think like on your list there is like for each of the steps there is a few solutions in the category. So for example, I'm personally, I feel like this is like one of the most interesting like column, which is, I guess, like because I see the FIA commercial all the time, not a commercial, but like I guess the FIA videos over my LinkedIn. I wonder, is there like a platform that people would actually go on to compare pricing, or do you feel like people will just try to beat it? Because I think like for the transaction and payment, and like I think the rest of the, I guess, like the product catalog and everything. So like I mean, I also saw Daydream. I feel like it was a very, I think it's different. Well, I think as I remember, I think it was more of basically I feel like the AI UI are like all are very similar ish to ChatGPT. I also met like a lot of like New York based like fashion ish platforms. A lot of it were kind of like, oh, gave me like basically we'll show you some kind of inspirations, and I'll like give you recommendations on what you should be wearing. But I don't think a lot of them are very differentiated from like a ChatGPT or something. I guess like in those like different bracket, like what are something that you feel like will have the most potential to actually become a billion-dollar company?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you in the sense that if like, things like ChatGPT already have so much usage and they're already getting these commercial questions today, I think the set of people that will use a verticalized commerce platform and download a new app, right? If you're like I think it's going to be smaller, and it'll have to be people where it'll have to be an experience that's purpose built for maybe like discovery and things, where it's not just about I have a product in mind, I'm going to come search here on what's the best shoe to buy, or the best whatever it is to buy. Because I think those queries, if it's once in a while, you're better off just using the app you already have installed, which for many people is something like a ChatGPT or maybe a Perplexity. But then for the people that are, like to discover items, and I think many of them are doing this thing where you have like an AI avatar of yourself, so you can try it wearing different items in a wardrobe before you buy. So I think they'll have to innovate on things like that to have like a value proposition that's strong enough that a consumer is going to download a new app for it. Because I go back to the stat, it's a little bit dated, but I think it was something that the median consumer is downloading 0 new apps a year. I think it was from a few years ago. But the idea that most people are kind of, they already have the apps that they use on their phone, and very few are actually interested in downloading new apps. I do think that's changed with AI because, since AI happened, like I personally have started downloading a lot more apps. I think even ChatGPT is like, basically everyone's downloaded in the last 2 years or so, 2.5 years. And so it has changed a little bit, but I do still think that bar is so high to download and then also actually retain on a new app over time. And so I do think they'll have to innovate on other things beyond just like, oh, here's a chat interface and you can ask it and it'll give you recommendations. But I do think the other thing that agentic commerce unlocks once we have all the infrastructure is that any company can make anything on the entire web shoppable in theory, because you can imagine that you don't have to have a relationship with that vendor necessarily to be able to allow checkout against their store on your app, where you can just use some of the infrastructure that would be in place or an agent that completes the transaction. And so in that sense, you might see a lot more innovation as well, because in the past, it was kind of like you had to go individually scrape every website. You had to, and you still couldn't check out on them. You had to kind of get permission. You had to partner with them. Whereas now it could become a bit more permissionless in that regard. And so I think we might see some interesting innovation there. In terms of other areas of the stack, I do think one that it's become very clear in the last 6 months or so that is an important area is this kind of merchant visibility and optimization. And I think this, as I mentioned, is beyond just commerce. Like I think it's true for everyone, where you see all these stats about ChatGPT usage growing, Google search queries potentially declining, and SEO was such an important channel for so many companies. And I think on ChatGPT, what happens is that once you get a user from that, ChatGPT almost takes them down the funnel a little bit. And so when they come to you, they almost have higher intent even than if they came to you from Google. And so this idea of showing up in the answer engines, whether you're a regular company and it's just about, if someone asks like, what software should I buy for ABC and your name showing up, or if it's, hey, if someone asks like, what pair of jeans should I buy and your specific brand's jeans showing up, I think that's going to become increasingly important. I think companies are already recognizing it. And so that kind of bucket, I think, has become clear that it is going to be an important area. I think there's still questions about, like how big will that category get, and like what are like the existing SEO players like SEMrush going to do. But I think that's one where there's a lot of demand from companies. And so it is clear that it is needed. And there's a clear parallel to the past world of SEO. I do think in agentic commerce, though, we might see stuff much beyond that, where it's not just about, hey, like our storefront or our brand has to show up in these engines, but it's like, how do we give ChatGPT all the data about every single one of our product SKUs so that it can recommend the best stuff to the people at its time? And so you might see these things where brands are voluntarily giving special data, which maybe is not even published online, to ChatGPT and these providers, so that their products and SKUs can show up for the right searches, because you have the detailed information on things like quality or even just things like pricing and real-time inventory and sizing and all those things.
I personally feel like there is like two kind of buyers in the consumer space. Like one is obviously if you need something, like the utility side of things, and then the other part is like the vibe check. So I think I would buy everything on TikTok, or like TikTok if recommended me something, even this thing is like $2 more expensive than this other thing, I will like still go for whatever is passing the vibe check.
Yeah.
But I feel like there is a lot of utility in the SaaS or like the utility space, or like when you need like a fridge, I would literally just go on ChatGPT or somewhere to like compare pricing and like, think about the functionality. I wonder, you have invested in a stealth mode company that's in the advertising space. Why don't we talk about like how do I rank differently for ChatGPT versus if I just rank on Google? Because I thought like the ChatGPT model or like all the information were primarily, like obviously I don't know about ChatGPT particularly, but I feel like for Perplexity, a lot of the results are kind of like giving, Google, right? So like, I guess like, but it's just like a very different, I guess, experience. Like when you are like trying to find some answer to something, like how do I use XYZ app, or like how do I use, it's kind of like the how to kind of questions goes to Perplexity, but how do I rank differently, or like just like have a better SEO as an AI company?
Yeah, and we have a company called AirOps, which helps companies with this, and so they've published some
Mhm,
good research and things around this, and so a lot of what I say is kind of based on some of that. But I think a couple of things. So one is that the first thing that companies need to do is even just figure out what kinds of queries related to their product are people
mhm,
potentially searching for on these LLMs, like on
mhm,
ChatGPT and others, and then where you show up today, because that'll give you a sense of maybe there are certain kinds of questions that you don't think about, that you haven't created content geared towards, that are important, that
oh,
you're not ranking. And so I think that's one, which is like you need to know how you show up so that you can create content tailored to these channels. I do think another big difference between ranking on Google versus ranking on ChatGPT is that Google was giving you a list of links, and so typically you wanted your own website to show up in that list,
mhm,
whereas on ChatGPT is giving you answers. And so, for example, if someone asks, like, I think you were talking about what's the best refrigerator, on Google it would be like, like you had to rank for the query best fridge with your website,
mhm,
whereas on ChatGPT it could be that all you need to, it's like there might be a Reddit uh, a thread about what fridge do you recommend for ABC type person, and that's the reason you end up ranking. And it doesn't matter what led to you showing up, because as long as your brand shows up, that's good enough. And
mm,
so I think these other areas like Reddit and like some of these other aspects, which actually tend to weigh pretty heavily in ChatGPT at times, are quite important in the ranking, because you may show up because of not something on your
mhm,
website, because of something externally that was
mhm,
talking about you. And so I do think there's an extra emphasis on what's being said about your product, and can you kind of spark discussions about your product being the best in certain circumstances. And I think the third one is that the way people use Google or typical traditional search versus these ChatGPT things is a bit different, in that I think it was Arvind from Perplexity that I forget the numbers he said, but it was something like the typical Google search query is like 3 to 4 words, whereas the typical search on Perplexity has like 10 or 12 words. And so they sometimes I just have more detail in the query itself. And so you can imagine something like like a fridge, like you can break it out into much longer tail sets of questions, like what's the best one for a couple, or in a small home,
mhm,
or in a large home, or that has ABC feature, or things like that. And so each of those become important kind of things that you can optimize for, maybe more so than Google. I mean, long tail keywords were also important at Google, but I think they may become more important in a chat based world, where people just are used to typing in longer questions that are more precise, or that have more detail in them. And so I think that's probably like the other piece of it.
mm. I That's so interesting, like, but how do you know, like, which one will rank more importantly, like Reddit or something? Or is this more of like the volume game? So like for example, in the past, maybe you buy, I don't know, like certain keywords or something on Google SEO and then it rank you a little bit higher. So basically you pay like a Google tax. I mean, I don't know, like I'm not aware of like if that's how it actually works, but let's say you buy like a certain SEO keywords and then you got ranked on top. But now, like, is it based off like volume or is this based off like authenticity slash like maybe if you have a longer response, how does data kind of show that what would be like a better thing than
Yeah.
the other?
Yeah, I would say it's still a little bit of an emerging field, but I think so on Google, the way it worked was that there were two things you could do. One was either you basically could do stuff on your website, so on-site SEO, which is things about just having like clean heading tags and well-named URLs, and use headings for the keywords that you want to rank for, and all of that. And I think all of that is still true in
Mhm,
the world of AI SEO, with the added caveat that you want to make sure that your pages are easily crawlable, and so
mhm,
clean text, and it's like very easily scrapable by these possible by these engines.
mhm,
And I think the second aspect was the in Google was offsite SEO, which is like the more backlinks you have from other websites linking to your website that are also considered to have domain authority in the areas that you want to rank for, and
mhm,
if they link back to you with the keywords that you want to rank for, that helps you. And so I do think there's this world of where people would buy quote unquote what's called backlinks. And so let's go buy
mhm,
backlinks from other websites or pay people to link to our domain. And I do think some of that it still works in for ChatGPT, but I think there's this added thing of it doesn't have to necessarily link back to your domain if it mentions your brand, because ultimately you want your brand's product to show up. It's still so emerging that I don't think anyone's cracked it, because ultimately there's like a little bit of a cat and mouse game, right? Where there are marketers that are trying to optimize and game it such that their companies show up on top. And then if you're OpenAI or Perplexity, you want the search and you want your results to be as clean and like not SEO optimized as possible, because you want to show the best items, not the ones that were SEO optimized to be the best. And so in some ways, I hope it doesn't happen too much, because I do think Google got gamed to such an extent that many brands believe that they have to just pay for buy ads to get traffic, because they like the people that were better than them SEO just like would overtake them, even though their products might be better. And so it's possible that happens in a ChatGPT as well at some point, but at least for now, I think it's more like it's based on all the volume of training data that went into them, plus the crawl that they do at real time when you make a query. And so you can just do a bunch of small stuff to help optimize it such that your products or brands can show up more on it. And then I'm sure the algorithms will change over time, because they want to prevent too much gaming of the system.
I want to maybe dive into another article of yours. So why don't we talk about seat strapping? I feel like this was very like popular. This is still like a very popular word. So like I guess like people now could raise like a really small round and then started, strapping afterwards. So like do you see, I guess like if you could, maybe we could start with like explaining like what are the trends that you are seeing and what type of company could kind of like pull off seat strapping versus what type of company will keep requiring capital to grow into something bigger.
Yeah, and so this is one where I ended up writing it because a few people asked me, because it kind of it started to come up quite often, interestingly, including from founders. I think the idea is basically this idea that it's an in between to like kind of a venture backed company and bootstrapping, in which you don't raise any money, where you raise a seed round, typically maybe somewhere between $1 million to 3 to 4 million, or maybe 500K to 3 million or so. And so you raise a seed round, and then you use that to build a product, get a team, get to some level of product market fit and revenue scale, and then you never raise again. And so the idea is that you become at that point then profitable on that kind of seed round that you raise, such that you at least have the option to never raise again if you don't want to. I think it's still the renewed interest in this has come in the last couple of years for AI. I think for a couple of reasons. One is on the revenue side, some of these AI companies are growing revenue faster than ever before, and so they're finding product market fit faster. They are the adoption rates are just higher because there's so much interest in buying these things, both from SMBs and prosumers, and then also from enterprises. And so they're growing revenue and getting to product market fit faster. And at the same time, they're able to operate a lot more efficiently with AI. So it's like you're growing revenue faster and getting to scale, or to some revenue scale quickly, and you need fewer people on the cost side, and so you have lower costs as well. And so when you have both those things, what that means is that if you think about the typical burn needed to get to some point, that reduces a lot. And some of these companies are getting profitable with 5 people, like 1 year into the journey of their business, and that kind of thing. I think in terms of, I do think ultimately this question is very much like what do you as the founder want to do and what is the market that you're in, what is the right approach for that market. So you might be a company where you get to say 3 to 5 million or 10 million of revenue with 10 people on like $2 million raised, and now you have a point of, if this is like $1 billion market and there are going to be 20 other companies competing with you, and you want to compete for that big prize, it's going to be tougher to do so without raising other capital. Because I think I had this tweet from Parker Conrad of what happens is like your competitors will all raise the money, and then they'll use their money to continue to do R&D in their product, which means that then, and they'll be more aggressive on go-to-market, which means like your product will fall behind competitors' products, and so you will end up losing the market. And so if you're somebody that is playing in a large market, still believes that market is opportunities up for grabs, and additional capital, which funneled into R&D or kind of sales and marketing, will help grow this thing more quickly, then it's probably the right move to raise that additional capital and not, quote unquote, seed-strap all the way. And so I think what those tend to look like then is that the company, like, raise a seed round, and then typically it's like, you get to 1 to 2 to 3 million and raise a Series A. Maybe some of these things get to 10, 15 million and then they skip a Series A and then they straight raise like what is effectively a Series B. And then I think the other approach is if you realize that, hey, this is a small market or it's a niche market, or I think I found a nice niche, but I'd have to, like, the product works for this niche, but the market opportunity is more capped. Then maybe the right approach is that you actually never raise again and you continue to grow, and could actually grow to a reasonable scale, like maybe even hundreds of millions of dollars, but maybe not at an explosive rate because you can't invest as much in R&D if you'd raise more money, but you can still get to like some meaningful scale. And it also gives you this option of you could run the business in a different way. Like perhaps it's run profitably where you dividend out money to all the employees every year as profits, or it gives you more of this optionality of maybe you decide that you want to end up just kind of selling this on a revenue multiple or profit multiple basis 3-4 years down the line in a way that could still be very good for everyone involved, even if it's not a big exit. Like it might be a $50 million or $100 million exit, but everyone does really well because you didn't raise that much money. And so essentially most employees and founders own most of the company. And so I think that is kind of like the options that emerge for these companies. And generally the right approach just depends on the founders and and the market that they're in and what they feel like their vision of the company is. Like, do they want to go for this, like multi-$100 million revenue or billion in revenue type of outcome where they probably should raise some more money, but maybe they skip the Series A? Or do they want to kind of run this as a profitable business, continue to grow, but maybe a bit more slowly, and keep options open for other kinds of outcomes where everyone still can do really well, because most of the company is owned by founders and employees and very little kind of capital has been raised.
I wonder, so like, is there any, I guess, for the company that decided to do seed strap, like, I guess, like, what is like a typical valuation? Is there like a typical valuation for the new Series A, or like, because I feel like you see some of, like, whenever it hit the news, I feel like it's always like a really huge run for like companies that are raising Series A. So like it's very different than the past. Is there like a new benchmark of like what kind of growth that you supposed to hit? And then like, is there like a benchmark people that typically compare you to, or like a regular, like the new regular benchmark for the record, like what you can.
I would say there's nothing super standardized about it, but I think one kind of big difference that I've seen sometimes is that, yes, and I think Series A is that even the traditional Series A's have grown in size, right? So some companies raise $10 to $15 million Series A's, but then some of them raise $30 million Series A's, $40 million Series A's. I think with these companies, what is true is that I don't think they end up raising that much more money. Like it might just look like a $30 to $40 million round, which some could say is just a lot Series A. And so it's true. But I think the thing is that some of them, they end up diluting a lot less. So it'll often be, sometimes I've seen rounds like 30 on 300 or things like that, which typically Series A's are still in that, most Series A's are still in that kind of 15 or 22.5% dilution round. Whereas some of these ones, but Series B's tend to be in the 10 to 15% dilution often. And so they end up raising like that 30 to 40 sometimes, but it'll be like a less dilutive round because in some ways it's like a Series B company. And so it might be like 300 posts, 400 posts, like in that range. It just depends on the progress they've made. But yeah, some of these ones generally that are you consider as quote unquote skipping the A are usually at 10 million, 12 million, 15 million of revenue run rate often at the time of these rounds. But that's not the only thing that matters, right? It's also about the growth and the retention and all of those things. But generally they get to like these 8-figure type run rates on the seed. And some of them may not get that, but they might just still be profitable and going. So they won't raise until they get to that point.
I want to be mindful of time. Maybe we'll do like one real question and then quick 30 minutes fire round.
Sure. Yeah. Sounds great.
The real question is like, what's your like typical, like as an investor, like how do you leverage AI from deal sourcing, diligencing to like winning to exiting?
I would say I probably use it most in diligence today. And typically it's more in terms of if I'm trying to just go deep in a space, particularly one that I don't know as well, I think it's been great for just getting up to speed on it very quickly. And so in identifying, maybe sometimes it's I don't think it's great at identifying other startups in the
Mhm.
space, just because I don't think it, like, some of them are very in stealth, right? So it doesn't have some of
Mhm.
that, but it is very good at like giving you a sense of the current market landscape,
Mhm.
what the big companies are doing in the space, what the incumbents are doing, who are the other competitors, how the landscape's been evolving, what are everyone else doing. And so I probably use it the most in that diligence phase. And typically for kind of that early like market landscape type of view on a space. And I've also found a great way to just like brainstorm things with it. So I when I'm writing some of these posts or just doing like some of these prepared minds, I'll often just go back and forth with it of, hey, this is how I think about the space. How would you challenge my views? And then it'll be like, oh, maybe there's this other area that could be quite separate than that area you have, because for these reasons it's quite different. And so I've actually found that to be useful, less so in the course of like an active deal or active potential investment, but more so as I'm trying to develop my own point of view on a given area. Like as an example, like the agentic commerce thing we talked about, I may have gone back and forth with it on, do you think that these are two distinct parts of the stack, or that ultimately
Mhm.
they'll merge, and some of those kind of things, or like which ones are like incumbent likely to own versus startups going to own. And sometimes it has differing points of view than me, and it kind of like is a good is good for just that kind of back and forth, and to challenge some of your thinking and to refine it further.
For sure. I want to end with a quick 30-second fire round for you. What's your favorite book?
Uh, I probably like business biographies, and so a Ride of a Lifetime is good. The Walter Isaacson's on Elon Musk, on Steve Jobs, the Jim Simons, the Rent Tech Founders book. So books of that sort, I would say.
I was like actually listening to the Elon Musk book. It was like definitely very interesting. I don't know how can someone capture so much detail of someone's life. I'd be like so threatened if someone just like writes so much detail about a certain things about me. But who would you invite to your dinner party?
Oh, uh, uh, it's this person called Sir Alex Ferguson. He managed, or he used to manage Manchester United, which is the team I support. So probably him. He actually has also written this book about leadership with Mike Moritz of Sequoia. But yeah, that's a very good book, and I think there's probably a lot to learn from him on just leadership and managing people, because he managed a lot of basically like prima donnas in their prime of their careers that needed a lot of kind of like the disciplinary action and management to get the best out of them.
Wow. Who made the biggest impact in your career?
Uh, I think it would have to be kind of my parents. Like I grew up in India, and I think they created the opportunities for me to be able to come to the States for
Mhm.
college 15 years ago. And I think ultimately that's obviously been the biggest kind of difference, or the biggest definitely the biggest kind of the most like life-changing thing in my kind of career and life. And so it definitely would have to be them.
Where can we find you outside work?
Um, you will often find me at the gym. Also, just all around. I actually split my time between New York and Palo Alto, so often both those areas. But I like to walk a lot, so
Mhm.
I often randomly run into people on the streets, like in either like downtown Palo Alto, or just all around like West Village or the West Side Highway in New York. And so that's where you can kind of find me IRL. And then online on Twitter, my handle is Tanay J, and that's where you can find me. And yeah, online.
Amazing. Well, Tanay, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was such an informative conversation about AI agents.
Thank you for having me, Grace. Really enjoyed this, as I have enjoyed listening to all the great content that you put out.
Amazing. Okay, let me quickly end stream.